Hello, my name is Roger Robb, and I'm an advocate specialist for the Georgia Council for the Hearing Impaired here in Atlanta, Georgia. The purpose behind our video today is because we've noticed out in the world that in many different places of business, mental health facilities, doctors' offices, different places of business, that they're not really sure how to make their facility more accessible for people with hearing loss. So that's the purpose behind the video today, and I hope that you will learn something new. So let's talk a little bit about culture. What exactly is culture? What does that mean? Culture has many different meanings. It can mean your identity, your history, your language, your values, the clothes that you wear, the food that you eat, your lifestyle, your political beliefs, or the art that you like. There are many different aspects that make up culture. So let's talk about deaf culture. Deaf people have a culture, and it's a very rich culture. There are many different aspects of deaf culture. Underneath the heading of deaf culture, there are 4 different subgroups. The first subgroup we're going to talk about today are those people that are deaf, those people that identify themselves as culturally deaf. Now, what does that mean? It means that I label myself as deaf. I am a deaf person. I am included in the deaf world. The next subgroup are those people that are culturally hearing, or those that were raised orally. They're deaf, but they feel more involved in the hearing world. They prefer to speak or read lips. The next 2 groups are the mainstream group and the residential group. Now, mainstreaming, what does that mean? It means that a deaf student is sent to public school. They go to class with other hearing students and possibly some other deaf students. Whereas the residential group, that means that they go to the deaf school, the residential school, and their teachers are deaf and the other students are deaf, and they can all sign. The residential group is definitely involved in the deaf world, whereas mainstream students, they're not typically involved in the deaf world. Another group are the educated group. And what does that mean? It means those people who've perhaps gone to college and graduated. Maybe they went to college, had a few years, but didn't graduate or didn't finish. Those people still tend to label themselves as being educated. Perhaps that might mean they went to Gallaudet University or to NTID, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, or maybe they went to CSUN, California State University at Northridge. These people tend to label themselves as being educated. Now, our next group is the grassroots group. Now, what does that mean, grassroots? They're set in their old ways. They won't change their way of thinking today because of technology. They still want to use their old ways of thinking. I'm going to give you an example. Some people really get attached to the way that they use sign language, and they won't change because of technology today. A good example is telephone, the sign for telephone. Now, a long time ago, the sign for phone was this. Now, I've noticed that many people in the grassroots group still today use this sign for telephone, even though we use the new sign for phone, or pager, or cell phone. And they're still using that old sign for telephone. The last group is a cochlear implant group. Some deaf people have a cochlear implant. And that finishes the first identity group of deafness. Our second identity group is the hard of hearing group. Now, the hard of hearing group has 4 different subsets. The first subset we'll talk about are those hard of hearing that consider themselves culturally hearing. They're more comfortable and more involved in the hearing world. Our second subset are those hard of hearing people that consider themselves culturally deaf. Now, some hard of hearing can hear a little, but they tend to be more involved in the deaf world. Our third subset are the hard of hearing students that tend to go to mainstream schools. That means that they feel more comfortable socializing with hearing students. And the last subset are the cochlear implant group. Some hard of hearing people tend to have a cochlear implant. That helps increase their ability to hear. Our third identity group are the late deafened adults. In this group, they tend to be born hearing, but later in life they lose their hearing. So they tend to be culturally hearing. They're deep-rooted in the hearing world. This group tends to rely heavily on the cochlear implant. They were born hearing, they grew up hearing, and the implant helps them to hear so that they can still be involved in the hearing world. Our fourth and final identity group are the deaf-blind individuals. Now, there are 4 different subsets to this group. The first subset are those individuals that were born completely deaf and completely blind. They've never had any vision, they've never had any hearing. They've had no experience with light, it's been total darkness and total silence their entire lives. The second group are the visually impaired. Now, what does it mean to be visually impaired? It means that they may have a little bit of vision, but they still struggle to see. Things may be cloudy or they may have a limited vision field. The third group are those individuals with Usher's syndrome. Now, Usher's syndrome tends to be passed down from generation to generation. It's a genetic disease. They're born deaf, but later in life they lose their vision. Now, our last group are the late deafened and blind adults. It means they were born deaf or born with vision, and then later in life they lose their hearing and then they lose their vision. And those are the 4 different groups under the deaf-blind identity group. I want to share with you the story now about how my parents figured out I was deaf. Now, my parents adopted me, they brought me home, and they thought that I was a hearing baby. For the first, I'd say, year and a half, they thought that I was hearing. They said that I acted like I was a hearing baby. They thought that I could hear. My parents had to work during the day, so they used to take me to the church nursery. That's how they started to suspect that maybe something was wrong. One day, one of the women who worked there, she noticed something sort of strange. That while all the other babies were sleeping, that what would happen is if one of the babies started to cry, then all the other babies would wake up and start to cry. Except me. I would sleep right through it. She thought that was kind of strange. She started to suspect that maybe I was deaf. And so when my mother came to pick me up, she said, I think I need to tell you that I think your son may be deaf. My mother said, no, my son's not deaf. My son can hear. And the woman said, well, how do you know for sure? So that woman told her what had happened, and my mom looked at her and didn't believe her. And the woman at the church said, well, maybe you should just take your son and have his hearing tested. My mom was really resistant, and she said no. But later she started to think things over and thought, well, maybe I should go see if everything's okay. So she decided to take me to the audiologist's office. So we went to have my hearing tested. They put the headphones on me and they tested me. When they finished, they let my mom know that, yeah, your son is deaf. My mom said, no, he can't be deaf. That's not possible. Go ahead and test him again. Your test's wrong. My son is not deaf. Go ahead and test him again, please. So I said, okay, fine. So they tested me again. Got the same results. But my mom said, how is that possible? Every time I yell at him, he turns around and looks at me. The audiologist was a little confused. And he said, show me what you do when you yell at him. So my mother, she put me in the middle of the floor and she yelled at me. And sure enough, I turned around and looked at her. And my mother said, see, I told you, look, he looked at me. He's a hearing child. And you're telling me that he can't hear me. Now, the audiologist sat back and he sort of chuckled a bit. And he realized that the exact opposite thing was happening. My mother said, well, how is that possible? But what my mother failed to realize was happening was that each time she would yell at me, she would hit her foot on the floor at the exact same time. And the house that we lived in was built in the 1960s and it had hardwood floors, and whenever my mom would hit her foot on the floor, I'd feel the vibrations, and that's how I would know that something was going on, and I turned around to look. My mother was completely heartbroken. She didn't have any idea what to do. My baby's deaf. My baby's deaf. What am I supposed to do with this deaf child? But luckily for my mother, the audiologist knew a deaf woman, and he put my mother in contact with her. And that woman was wonderful. She made sure that my mother had all the right information so that she could make the right choices for me, and she discussed each of the different choices with my mother. She discussed about the mainstream options, about the residential school options, about using hearing aids, being raised orally without any sign, or total communication, which means having a hearing aid and sign language, being raised orally, all of the different options. And that's the story about how my parents found out I was deaf. Culture. Now let's talk a little bit about culture and language. Deaf culture has a language. I want to discuss the different ways we communicate in deaf culture. The first way we communicate is with sign language. There are 3 different groups under the heading of sign language. First, we have American Sign Language, or ASL. That means you sign like I do. It's the deaf's natural way of communicating with one another. The next one we have is PSE, which is Pidgin Signed English. Now that's really not a language. It borrows rules from ASL, and it borrows rules from SEE. I'll explain SEE a little bit later. So PSE is sort of a mixture of ASL and Signed Exact English. It falls on that continuum. Now, the third group is Signed Exact English. That means that it follows English word order. I am going to the store to go shopping. Most deaf people prefer to use ASL or PSE. Those are their 2 preferred ways to communicate. The next mode of communication I want to talk about is aural, A-U-R-A-L. It's of or relating to hearing. Some deaf people depend on their ears for listening or for reading lips. They're more orally based. The next mode of communication is simultaneous communication. Now, what does simultaneous communication mean? It means it's copied communication. With the deaf person, they're watching someone sign and they sign exactly what they're saying. The next mode of communication is written communication. And sometimes deaf people are stuck. There's no interpreter available, so the only way to communicate is to write letters back and forth. Our next mode of communication is cued speech. This is a really special way to communicate. They don't use sign language to communicate. Instead, they use phonetics, and they match those phonetics with different hand shapes in and around the mouth and the face. It's a really interesting way to communicate. Another mode of communication is limited sign language skills. Now, what does limited sign language skills mean? It means you have limited ability to sign. Maybe you're not quite sure how to sign. Maybe you've moved here from another country, for example, Mexico, and you've got limited ability to sign English. You're more comfortable with MSL. The next way to communicate is through gestures. I mean, suppose you don't have any other way to communicate, any of the other ways that we discussed. Maybe gesture is the only way to get your meaning across. Also, another word for that could maybe mean home signs. It's an awkward way to sign, and it's a little hard to understand. What happens is, if parents have a deaf child, they don't know how to sign, they invent signs that they use in their own world to communicate. Now, continuing the discussion on culture. Culture has rules of behavior, and deaf culture has rules of behavior as well. One of those rules is, how do you get a deaf person's attention? Maybe you could gesture, wave at them to try to get the deaf person to see you. Another way would be to touch them, or maybe to pat them on the shoulder to get their attention. Or you could be maybe sitting at a table and tap the table so they would feel that, or you could stamp your foot against the floor so they'd feel the vibrations, and they would then be able to know that you wanted to get their attention. Those are some natural ways to get a deaf person's attention. One way that I don't recommend is that you get something, maybe a pencil or a piece of paper, and you throw it at the deaf person. That's just not something that you should do. Some other rules of behavior. Suppose that you see two deaf people having a conversation. Now, I've noticed that many hearing people have a tendency to hesitate, to walk right through a conversation, say, excuse me, and it takes them forever to walk through, and that can be very distracting. The natural, normal way to do that is just to walk right straight through. The deaf people aren't going to mind. They're not going to complain about that. We actually prefer that instead of you stealing our attention with excuse me, sorry, I don't want to bother you, and walking through. That means we have to stop our conversation. One really important thing that you need to remember when you're talking with the deaf person and you're using an interpreter or someone else, it's really important that you maintain eye contact with the deaf person. Look them directly in the eye. I know that most hearing people, they have the tendency not to be really good about eye contact. They'll look you in the eye and then they'll look away. They tend to do that a lot. I know that. Now, you might be confused as to why we're asking you to look the deaf person in the eye when the deaf person keeps averting their attention. They keep looking away. Well, one reason for that is because the deaf person has to look at the interpreter. And the interpreter is usually put off to the side. So the deaf person has to look away so that they know what's being talked about. Let's talk a little bit about conversations. We have two different types of conversations I want to talk about. There's public conversation versus private conversations. Now, it's a tendency of most deaf people to communicate right out in the middle of public. That's public, open communication. People can look in and they can see what's being talked about. Now, if a deaf person doesn't want everybody to be able to look at what they're talking about or see what they're saying, maybe tell their friend, hey, come here with me, and then they'll sign with their back to everybody so not everybody can see, or they'll walk around the corner or go into another room so that everybody can't see what's being said. Now, what I find really interesting about that concept is that I've noticed that in the hearing world, when hearing people are out socializing, there's talking going on all around them. And I noticed that hearing people don't listen to everything that's being talked about. Now, I thought that they did. That was really interesting to me. I really did. I asked some of my hearing friends, I said, hey, I'm curious, what are they talking about over there? And my hearing friends were like, I don't know, I wasn't listening. But I was confused. I'm not quite sure what's going on. I mean, it's public conversation. It's happening all around you, and you don't know what they're saying because you're not listening. It's different in the hearing world than in the deaf world. I want to let you know a few rules on how to interrupt a conversation. If two deaf people are having a conversation and they're talking, how are you going to best interrupt them? What's the best way to do that? Well, one way that you can do it is just to walk up along the side and to look in. A deaf person, then they're talking, they'll eventually notice you and they'll turn their head and look and say, what can I help you with? That's one way to interrupt a conversation. Another way might be to stand off to the side and wave to get their attention and say, I need to talk to you a second, excuse me, would you mind? That's a good way to do it. A third way might be if you see two people having a conversation is just to walk up and Stand off to the side and wait for one of them to notice you. Eventually they'll look at you standing there. That's another good way to get their attention and to interrupt a conversation. And that's just a few different rules of behavior in deaf culture.